You will not be able to fall asleep while watching Godzilla Minus One. Which I guess we'll just talk about that next, huh? So, folks, there's this movie monster called Godzilla, and is basically oh, this is going to be full on spoiler review of Godzilla. Okay, I'm doing a spoiler review of Godzilla. I'll tell you when the spoilers will start, but there will be spoilers, so um, I will give you a heads up when the spoilers are about to happen. Okay, but basically, there's a movie monster called Godzilla. Um, Movie came out in the 1950s, made by Japanese directors. It's a whole iconic movie monster, one of the most famous movie monsters of all time. Famously represents, the horrors of nuclear war and like nuclear proliferation, and kind of a warning to humanity about, that the horror of that. Over time, this monster has kind of become more of like a campy hero type character rather than the destructive force of nature that it was originally kind of intended to be. Um, the original is one of the best movies of the 1950s, certainly, but also just one of the best movies of all time. It is well made. And over time, though, like, basically became like a monster grudge match type thing where you'd have an actor in a Godzilla suit doing wrestling moves to fight an actor in like a gorilla suit, or some other crazy monster design. um and those are very fun on their own, but they're fun in a very different way, and they're not necessarily good movies. They're just fun to watch, and basically that trend continued up until a movie called Godzilla Final Wars, where basically all of the fun movie monsters that they'd come up with over like the last, 50 plus years of making Godzilla movies all make an appearance in a gigantic battle royale type situation put together by aliens, because of course. And that was kind of it, right? Like that it kind of ended there. And then we had the American, I think 2014 Godzilla movie. And that kind of started its own trend of American movie Godzilla, which is much more in vein of kind of that campy type of fun, though it has kind of some pretentious, no, this is cinema elements to it. However, at the end of the day, you still have movies where it's like giant gorilla punches giant reptile that can breathe fire. And in response to kind of the initial American Godzilla, which to kind of put in perspective, America tried to make its own Godzilla movie in the year 2000, and it was terrible. Basically, most of the actors in it are voice actors from The Simpsons, which is delightful in its own way. 1998. My bad. I get it confused with Godzilla 2000 for whatever reason. But you basically have uh the voice cast of The Simpsons all cast as real people in the movie, and it's really bad, and but in a fun way. It's directed by Ronald Emmerich, the guy who did Independence Day, so it's about as cheesy and corny as that, but now you have the actors from The Simpsons in it. And basically, ever since then, the production company behind Godzilla, Toho, has kind of had like a weird vendetta against American made Godzilla films. So even though they licensed Godzilla for kind of this American production franchise in like 2014 or so, they didn't really feel great about it. And kind of the lackadaisical reception to the 2014 American Godzilla led them to greenlight an amazing movie called Shin Godzilla. Shin Godzilla is essentially kind of a retelling of the original Godzilla, except it's almost like eldritch, and it's less about the Godzilla monster itself, which is kind of a nice change of pace, because a lot of the Godzilla movies have historically been kind of about Godzilla and Godzilla's relationships with these other monsters, which isn't bad. But it's more of a spectacle film. You're there to see Godzilla blow stuff up in a fun and new way. However, Shin Godzilla is not about watching Godzilla blow stuff up, though that definitely happens. It's much more about the human response to kind of this ecological disaster. It was kind of born out of the Fukushima Daiichi situation where a massive tsunami damaged the nuclear power plant Fukushima and created a colossal nuclear natural disaster. And what's fun about Shin Godzilla is essentially this blob monster, this horrific blob monster emerges from the sea, mutated by like radiation, and it becomes like this weird, ever-changing thing that is being warped by kind of the forces of mankind itself into a monster that then wreaks havoc upon mankind. And it is incredibly good, and it's less about individual actors within the Japanese government, but more so about how different parts of the Japanese government kind of are able to put aside their differences and come together in order to address this completely unknown and unexpected threat. It's really good, and I would say you should absolutely see Shin Godzilla before you see Godzilla Minus One. It's not exactly necessary viewing. You will be able to understand everything that happens in Godzilla Minus One if you haven't seen Shin Godzilla, but I think you'll get more out of Godzilla Minus One if you have seen it, because it comes out of a very similar place as Shin Godzilla. Like there's a lot of thematic elements shared between the two films, and also Shin Godzilla is, I guess, kind of a blueprint for Godzilla Minus One in a lot of different ways, and you'll see what I mean if you go and watch it. However, I just need to bring this up before we get into this. First of all, Godzilla Minus One is one of the best reviewed movies of the year so far. 97% tomato meter, 98% audience reaction. And I just have to pause. There's an alt-right media YouTube channel called Nerdrotic. Their channel looks like this. It has a very I guess effective template for itself. Just there's a black Aragorn now. Oh no, Marvel movies are dying. Oh look, Captain Marvel. You all hate Captain Marvel, right? Captain Marvel's destroying everything you love and care about. So it's that kind of a channel, and also, of course, has people on like Melanie Mack, who is just the worst, and Sargon of Akkad, who is, again, a guy who couldn't get elected in the UK because of his comments about being okay with, having sex with a child. So, as well as like raping fellow members of parliament. So, just class acts on this show. Nerdrotic has almost 1 million subscribers. And yeah, he's not good at what he does. I will say that this is maybe one of the dumbest things I've ever seen anyone who pretends to be a movie critic say. The message divides. Good stories bring people together. And I have to say, this is incredibly stupid because the messaging of Godzilla Minus One is expressly political. It takes place in the aftermath of World War II and talks about, basically people living in the rubble of American war crimes and how they're putting their lives back together and how they are now faced with this unimaginable threat for which they are not prepared, for which they are not, capable of responding to even. And the idea that these relationships and the power dynamics at play and the express messaging of the movie, like there are points where characters look into the camera and all but outright say exactly what the point of the movie is. And I can't imagine being so brain dead that you walk into this movie and just come away being like, huh, giant lizard, cool. Giant lizard laser, cool. Like that's what a lot of conservatives are taking away from this movie. That and like family values, even though the family values shown in this movie are antithetical to like everything conservatives talk about when they talk about family values. It's actually quite insane. So that being said, what can I say about this without getting into spoilers? Essentially, it's a movie about a guy, and in fact, like everyone in the movie is kind of in the same boat as this guy, who has survived the fires of war and who feels like he shouldn't have. And the same is true of almost everybody else in the film. And he struggles with that feeling throughout the movie. And the movie is in fact kind of like an argument for living, which is I think incredibly profound and beautiful, and was actually very, very moving in the theater. I heard some concern that this movie might do weird erasure of how bad Japan was in World War II, like portraying Japan as a small being who has anxiety and did nothing wrong ever. No, I don't think the movie does that. I think it's just not the focus of the movie. Like, imagine you're a person on the ground. You're a Japanese soldier on the ground during World War II, and you've never seen combat. And like, but you're given the order to like go and die. Like that's the extent to which the movie kind of like deals with that. But it's not a movie about like the rape of Nanking. It's not a movie about Japanese imperialism. It's a movie about people who are just trying to survive when the only homes they've ever known, and when they come back to them, are smoking ruins. You know? They're people who are predominantly civilians, predominantly like, dudes who like come back from the war and are like fucked up. But they're not, again, the characters in the movie aren't like, oh, you're the people who did the Bataan Death March. They're not the war criminals of Japan. And again, not all Japanese soldiers were war criminals. Like that's kind of the thing, right? We're given a very deliberate, small on the ground perspective. I haven't seen the director's previous work, but it could be that again. And I honestly I don't necessarily blame artists in Japan for wanting to focus on the generational kind of trauma of of like American fire bombings and like the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't blame them for focusing on that. The same way I don't necessarily blame, like, I don't know, Germans for you know dealing with All Quiet on the Western Front or something like that. Um does that make sense? I did not, at least let me put it this way. I did not walk away from the movie being like, "Ah, yes, this movie did apologia for Japanese war crimes." You know? At no point in the movie does it like touch on that. At no point in and honestly, like, my thing is that it doesn't go hard enough pointing the finger at America for the atrocities America did on Japan. That was my concern walking away from it, which is that, like, there is very little blame placed on America for, the firebombing of, like, of Japan, like, that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. And there are characters who have lost, like, their entire families due to this firebombing campaign against civilians. But, like, they're never like, yeah, the Americans killed my family. No, instead they're mostly pointing the finger at each other, or just talking about it as if it's just, as if it's as, you're better off blaming a mountain for causing a rock slide. That's kind of like the thing, right? And I would say that, like, I would say that there is a degree of, like, Japanese nationalism in it, but I think that's almost unavoidable when you're talking about, rebuilding a country from literal ashes. I think there is, like, a certain amount of pride and camaraderie that happens with that. So, like, I don't necessarily blame the movie for, like, having a bit of nationalism in it. I don't necessarily blame the movie for anything in it. I actually think it's like a 10 out of 10 movie for me. But I think it's a worthwhile question to ask. Like, does the movie kind of whitewash, like, historical crimes? And the answer to me is no. Um, but I will say that Godzilla, as portrayed in this movie, is terrifying. Um, and in a different way than from the original Godzilla or from Shin Godzilla. I think each of these three movies has a different type of fear associated with it. The Godzilla in the original, I think, is largely uh, like like, I mean, it's not I mean, they're all allegorical fears, but I think, like, that's kind of the predominant embodiment of the fear in that movie, is, like, understanding that allegory. Even if you don't understand the concept of allegory, I think there's something deeply traumatic and horrifying about Shin Godzilla, both in design and execution. But then you have the Godzilla in Godzilla Minus One, and it is much more like you are alone by a campfire at night in the woods, and you are aware that you're in a region that's full of tigers, and all of a sudden one of those tigers attacks you. That's the kind of fear that Godzilla Minus One has. Godzilla is much faster, much more visceral than I've seen him in any movie ever. And it is much more of a movie where the government fails, you know, all of the stopgap measures that are supposed to prevent or support. Uh-oh. Hello? God damn it. Hello? You're still here? Did you lose me? No? Okay. Both my monitors just suddenly went black. Okay, but they're back on. Cool. Um yeah, so it's a movie about like this raw, uncaged, animalistic force of nature, as opposed to like, you know, a coming thunderstorm. It is just the sudden annihilation. Um, and I think in that respect, it much more closely embodies like the feeling of nuclear annihilation, the feeling of, you know, going about your business and all of a sudden the sky begins raining fire, you know, from American planes. I feel like it is much more in line with that. And it is incredibly well executed. And with that, I think I don't think I can say much more without spoilers, other than this is definitely a movie you should see in theaters. This is definitely a movie you should see in theaters. Biggest screen available to you. All right, from here on, we're going into spoilers. If you want to mute the stream, I'll give you guys a thumbs up when I'm done, and you can unmute. All right. So I'm gonna start the spoiler rundown in 10, 9. Wait, hold on. When you say visceral, wait, ask the question. Do you mean like a Saw movie? No, I don't mean like a Saw movie. I mean, there are moments of like blood, but there's not like gore or anything like that. All right, I'm gonna be doing spoilers in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So essentially, this movie takes place slightly overlapping World War II, right? You have this young pilot who has been drafted into the Imperial, you know, military of Imperial Japan. The Japanese government knows that it's losing. However, it has ordered its pilots onto the fateful kamikaze missions. So essentially, this young pilot who has been through military training and expected to go like fight, you know, American fighter pilots, is now being told to essentially just dive bomb into American warships. And on the day he is slated to do that, he chickens out and decides instead he is going to fake that his aircraft had some kind of mechanical failure. So he lands on the battle-scarred island of Odo. And the mechanics there are like, listen, dude, we understand. Like, we are losing this war, and like, we also know that there's nothing wrong with your plane. But he feels deep amounts of shame and self-loathing in his failure to follow his fellow pilots, you know? And that night they're all eating together, and just all of a sudden, out of the depths of the ocean, Godzilla happens. And like, it's clearly not the Godzilla we're all familiar with. Like, it's a young or like unmutated Godzilla, but it's still, the size of, a T-Rex and a half. It's tall, huge, and can still tank gunfire really well. And it massacres the mechanics on Odo Island, and there's only 2 survivors. One being our kamikaze pilot, and then the other being the lead engineer on the island, who then directly blames the kamikaze pilot for not running and shooting it with the 20mm cannon that's attached to his fighter plane. So he then like throws all of the pictures of the mechanics' families at this kid, and blames him for all of their deaths before kind of vanishing into the ether. And then this pilot returns home to return to his parents, and the entire area in which he lived is just a smoldering ruin. His parents are both dead in the firebombing. His neighbor lost like her husband and all 3 of her kids in the firebombing, and she realizes that he was a kamikaze pilot and he didn't sacrifice his life, and she holds him directly responsible for her children dying. And like, this is just, I don't understand how you can watch the opening 15 to 20 minutes of this movie and be like, oh yeah, it's totally apolitical, bro. Like, it's literally about living in the aftermath of this global conflict and the interpersonal relationships and like coping mechanisms that everyone is using to try and survive in the aftermath of this political turmoil. And basically he builds himself like a little shack out of like his parents' old house and tries to figure out what to do with his life. And he winds up encountering just kind of this vagrant young woman who has a baby, and she follows him home and is just like, and she's kind of like a scoundrel, like she's been stealing in order to feed herself and the baby. And he's just like, yeah, sure, whatever, you guys can live here. And this winds up becoming like the heart of the movie, like these unexpected and improbable family dynamics developing in the aftermath of complete obliteration, And like, I think that's probably what like a lot of conservatives gravitate towards. Like, oh, it's a movie about family. It's a family picture. But like, ultimately, while that is true, like, the family dynamics that are being put in place are dynamics that conservatives fundamentally reject. Like, oh, you've just been living with this unwed woman? How scandalous. Oh, and it turns out the baby's not even her baby? Ugh, disgusting. Like, there's just a lot of different layers to it being this kind of construction of found family. And this young man winds up getting a job minesweeping, and because there's tons of mines littered in the waters around Japan at this time, and this is like as close as the movie gets to talking about how like America being like to blame for any of this destruction, because the boat he's expected to go minesweeping in is like a shitty wooden boat. And he got hired under the assumption that this is going to be like a well defended boat designed for minesweeping, but it turns out the boat is specifically designed around keeping it safe from American mines, because American mines are magnetic, because it's a wooden boat, so it's able to not attract those mines. And he kind of becomes like part of this boat crew, and throughout the movie they kind of become part of his family as well. Like they become the doting uncles and grandpas of his family, and it's really beautiful and lovely. But then they kind of, while they're doing this minesweeping, they stumble into what is being hidden from them by the general public, right? Or not by the general public. It's being hidden from the general public, but essentially the United States and the Japanese government are aware that there is basically this gigantic creature that's been sinking or disabling boats and ships across the Pacific Ocean, and they kind of get sent to try and buy time for this warship to show up that will be like better equipped to kind of handle whatever this is. And turns out it's Godzilla, and destruction and mayhem ensue that further scar this kamikaze pilot. And this is now like a year or two after the end of World War II. And it just winds up being this kind of this ongoing back and forth that the movie's having with itself about, the decision to continue living, and kind of the implications of that, the risks of doing that, the pain of doing that. And it winds up being one of the most compelling human stories I've seen play out in a Godzilla movie. Because typically it's less about the human beings in Godzilla movies and more about either systems, which is perfectly exemplified in Shin Godzilla, or it's like merely a vehicle for kind of the larger allegory. And like the story kind of takes a back seat. Or it's just a vehicle for special effects, which is the vast majority of Godzilla movies. But there's just something real about that discussion, especially like, I'm getting older, and like I can see that. Like I can see kind of this debate on the screen being echoed like inside my heart, especially as somebody who struggles with like chronic depression, where it's more of an open question. I think it's less easily settled in people like myself. Like, is perpetuating myself, is that good? Should I be doing that? And I mean, I'm not gonna go through the entire movie, but it's ultimately this movie that is about both personal and national mistakes coming back to haunt you, and then being able to make the decision to overcome them and move forward. And like the answer the movie gives and finally is that yes, you continue moving forward, you continue to live despite all these obstacles, despite everything, because ultimately it is worth it. Ultimately, there is, even if you lose everything, even if you lose absolutely everything and everyone you love, you can still find family. You can still find hope and love and reasons to keep living. You know, there's there's a scene in um Hayao Miyazaki's one of my favorite movies of all time, Princess Mononoke, where there's a scene where the main character interacts with a leper colony, and one of them talks about how like life is pain and suffering, but still you find reasons to keep on living. And I feel like Godzilla Minus One is an unlikely but incredibly effective vehicle for a message along those lines as well. So, spoiler section over. This movie made me feel a lot of feelings. This movie made me feel like just on a like both like on its own as a film, but also for myself, you know, like there's an element to it that just hit my heart, and it is it's hard to really articulate it, you know? But I mean, I guess I'm going to get a little personal. Uh sorry. But when I was a kid, right? When I was like 5 years old, um my dad would do a lot of work. You know, my dad made ads, like he was an advertising director. Um and he he would go away on business trips, right? And I remember that there was this one time. There's this one time he came back from one of his business trips, and he brought a VHS tape back with him, and it was Godzilla versus King Kong. And I remember watching it and just being like amazed. And of course, it does not hold up. It doesn't hold up at all. Like it's incredibly racist. I don't recommend showing it to a small child. Um, I don't really recommend showing it to many people. It's they do blackface. It's bad. It's bad stuff. Um, maybe watch it with somebody who's like 10 or 11 or 12, and like an age where you can properly contextualize the racism. And like Godzilla just kind of became a thing where I would go and watch Godzilla movies with my dad. Like it became like a family thing, right? And that stayed true right up until I came out to him as trans. And that like kind of ended my relationship with Godzilla movies, which you know, earlier I gave kind of like a timeline of how like the Japanese Godzillas kind of ended with Godzilla Final Wars, but then were triggered by, the 2014 Godzilla to start making new movies. And we never watched Shin Godzilla together. But like I just hadn't been able to really watch them without my dad. And there was just something really special seeing Godzilla Minus One, especially now that I'm out as myself. I'm out as a trans woman, and like being able to enjoy this again without him, you know? And there's also just something very sad about that, but being able to find this enjoyment and love of this thing, this franchise, which maybe that's cringe or whatever. I get it. It resonated with me, especially as somebody who, like, after I came out to my dad, I had to make the decision to continue living. And it was not an easy cut and dry decision for me. Like it was the closest I ever got to like going out into the garage and just turning on the car, And seeing Godzilla Minus One in theaters just like really tapped into that specific thing for me. So, weirdly, in a movie that is about and has so much destruction in it, the movie is primarily about hope and moving forward, and finding it within yourself to be able to do both those things. And it is incredibly beautiful. So, 10 out of 10. You all should go see Godzilla Minus One.